Nice to see you all. What a treat to be back in Vancouver and doing another event with Massy, this time with Massy Arts, not Massy Books. I'm so pleased that you all were able to make it tonight. This is formally, I guess, the last stop of a book tour that I've been on since the beginning of February. So it's been a long haul, and I'm a little tired. I'm not even done. It's just like this is the end of the book tour. Tomorrow I go to Estonia for something else, and then it just all kicks off again. So here's the thing. I write when I'm anxious. So during lockdown, I wrote 9 books. and one of those books was this book, Red Team Blues. And Red Team Blues, the conceit was that I could write the final volume in a long-running series about a beloved, roguish, kind of private eye figure, a guy named Marty, Hench, who's a forensic accountant who spent 40 years in Silicon Valley unwinding every weird finance scam that a tech bro could think of. So he's been through all of it. And I thought I could write his very last adventure with all of that kind of energy that you get in the last adventure of a beloved hero, you know, wrapping up a career you followed closely for years and years and years. And I could do that without all of the messy business of writing the previous volume. Sort of like if you had a TV show that was just the grand finale of a long-running show, like the last episode of MASH without the tedious business of the 11 seasons of MASH. And you could do that every night, like just another show, like tearful goodbyes, and then the audience is there, and all the cast come out, and they bring back Cousin Oliver. And anyway, so I wrote this book, and it kind of just blasted out of my fingertips. Like it was 6 weeks for the first draft from beginning to end. And I sent it to my editor. He's like a real stand-up guy, someone I've known. I met him on a bulletin board system in the 1980s, so I've known him since I was a teenager. And he's edited all of my novels, and he's a great guy, but he is not the world's greatest email correspondent. He would not think that I was disparaging him in any way. This is just truth. So I sent him the book expecting that it would be a long time before I heard back, and instead the next morning there was an email in my inbox, just 3 lines. That was a fucking ride. Whoa. and then he bought 3 of them. And I had a problem, because this is the last adventure of Marty Hench. And I've kind of grown to like the guy, and I kind of felt like he'd earned his retirement, like I bought into the bit at least. Getting a little high on my own supply, perhaps, but I really had to give it a think. Like, what was I going to do? Was I going to bring him out of retirement? There is some precedent for this. You know, Sherlock Holmes came back over Rickenbach Falls, right? But that was because Queen Victoria said that she would knight Arthur Conan Doyle if he brought Sherlock Holmes back. And you know, my editor is a very powerful man in New York publishing. He's a vice president of the Macmillan Company, one of the big 5, but he cannot knight me. So I had to think of something else. And I realized that if I wrote these out of sequence, that you'd lose just a tiny bit of the drama, right? Because if you know that he lives to be in this chronologically later book, then you know he can't die in the previous book. But that's broadly true of adventure novels that have a recurring character. No one ever picked up a Hercule Poirot novel and said, I wonder if he dies in this one, right? And then if you do that, you don't have to worry about continuity. Because you're not foreshadowing, you're backshadowing, right? And the more stuff you just make up and throw at the wall, the more of a premeditated motherfucker you appear to be. Right? Look, like you've just been planning this and playing the long game, and you're just making it up. So this is the second one, and it is the first one. Red Team Blues is a cryptocurrency heist. If you're going to write about tech bros and scams, cryptocurrency is where you should start, obviously. And obviously this was before the AI bubble. And if I ever do bring Marty out of retirement, maybe it'll be for an AI scam. But this book is set during the years roughly between the dot-com crash and the early Trump years. And it's the second one. It came out a year later. And there's a third one that's already in the can and on the publication schedule. It comes at this time next year, February of next year. It's called Picks and Shovels, and it's Marty Hench's first novel. And it tells about how he comes out to Silicon Valley originally as a computer science dropout who got a CPA and finds himself working for the bad guys, on the wrong side. He goes to work for a weird PC company. And if you remember the early 80s, if any of you remember PCs in the early 80s, there were a lot of weird PC companies in the early 80s. He's working for a company called the Three Wise Men. It's run by a Mormon bishop, a Catholic priest, and an Orthodox rabbi. And what it actually is it's a pyramid-selling faith scam. that uses pyramid selling within faith groups to extract lots of money from parishioners. And he realizes he's on the wrong side, changes sides, and helps some of their rogue employees destroy the company. So that's the one that's coming out next year. This one, The Bezzle, as I say, is set in this period after the dot-com crash and leading up to about 2016, 2017, the early start of the Trump years. And the title, Bezzle, B-E-Z-Z-L-E, not B-E-Z-E-L, that's the black rectangle around your phone screen. B-E-Z-Z-L-E is this very useful term coined by John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist. And he says it describes the magic interval after the con artist has your money, but before you know it's a con. And in that moment, everybody feels better off. Right? Everybody feels like they're richer. So long as nobody ever asks Sam Bankman-Fried for their money back, he's a billionaire and you're a billionaire. Everyone's great. It's only when you ask for the money back that it all falls apart. And of course, because of that, nobody really wants the Bezzle to end. Because we all have this feeling, and although we know it's wrong if we think about it just for an eye blink, we all have this feeling that the money only disappears when you discover it's a con. But the reality is the money is gone the minute you hand it over, right? Your money isn't gone once you scratch off the scratcher and find out you didn't win, right? Your money is gone the minute you hand it over the counter and get the scratcher. You know, you can prolong that moment as long as you want, but your money's already gone. You're not going to get it back. And so people like to live in the Bezzle, or at least they resent you for getting them out of the Bezzle. And Marty, being a forensic accountant who unwinds scams, had a lot of experience with different kinds of Bezzles. And this period, especially dot-com crash to the great financial crisis, was a hell of a Bezzle. A lot of people felt richer because it was during that period that we really supercharged the, in hindsight and even at the time, obviously bad idea that we should take shelter, a basic human right, and really just treat it as an asset and see how quickly we could inflate the price of it and flip the price and so on. You know, it was very weird when you think back on it that we had a government policy to increase the price of housing, this thing that everybody needs in order to survive. It would be as though you had a government policy to increase the price of bread, which is obviously not a government policy, it's a private policy of Galen Weston. But it would be very weird to see anyone running for office on that basis, but you have lots of people running for office on the basis that they won't let your house price depreciate. And so during that period when we were spinning out financial derivatives of houses, everybody felt better off, and it wasn't until we had that reckoning in 2008 that everyone found out that they weren't. And during that period, something very funny happened with technology. This was a period in which the Saudi royal family went to a guy called Masayoshi Son, who ran a venture capital fund called SoftBank, and gave him tens of billions of dollars, which he then spent buying every promising Web 2.0 company and destroying it through his major investment, Yahoo. You'll remember this period when Yahoo bought every promising Web 2.0 company and turned it into a pile of shit. This was before Masayoshi Son realized that you didn't actually even need to wait for a company to come along. You could just pump money into like just random sociopaths and they could do the same thing. So that he then went on to fund Uber, WeWork, and a bunch of other companies that had made you miserable. But back then he was doing things to like Flickr, Vancouver's favorite tech company, and Upcoming, and all these other, you know, webrings.com and GeoCities, all these other great little startups. So Marty's got a friend who sold him one of these companies, and he's realized that he is now in the pit of vipers that is Yahoo, where the purpose is not to try and make things that people like, but rather to sabotage the other minor princelings of the Yahoo empire, climb the corporate ladder, and then escape and do something else. And he doesn't want to do that. So he reads the employee handbook very carefully. He reads his contract because he's a vice president, because he sold a company to them. He reads California employment law, and he realizes that he's entitled to a lot of time off. Like even more time than the French employees take. And so he starts taking 4-day weekends, 5-day weekends. He takes them 20 weeks a year, 30 weeks a year. He takes them 40 weeks a year, and then he takes another 5 weeks holiday because he's entitled to it all. And the place that he likes to go and the place that he takes Marty is a place called Catalina Island. One of my favorite places in the world. It's a real place. If you've ever heard the old jazz song Avalon, it's about the town on Catalina, Avalon. Catalina Island, so it's a beautiful little kind of Mediterranean-style island off the coast of Long Beach. The channel between Catalina and Long Beach is the deepest channel known to humanity. Like a lot of islands, it has very weird flora and fauna. It has an island dwarf and an island giant. So there's a squirrel the size of a fox, and there's a fox the size of a squirrel. It also has some very weird invasive species. And I should explain before I tell you about these invasive species who own the island. There's a guy called William Wrigley Jr. If the name Wrigley rings a bell, it's because William Wrigley Jr. Started the Wrigley Chewing Gum Company. And you may think that he made his fortune from chewing gum, but you'd be wrong. Does anyone know how Wrigley made his fortune? Trees. William Wrigley Jr. bought all the chicle trees in the world, which meant that if you were his competitor and you wanted to make chewing gum, you had to pay him. So it didn't matter whose gum you chewed, William Wrigley got paid. So like every monopolist, he got very rich, and like every monopolist, he lost 40 points off his IQ. And he just pursued some weird hobbies. So he bought this island, he built a beautiful dance floor there. It's a building called the Casino, though there's no gambling in it. In Latin, casino means a gathering place, which is a thing that nobody knows. And so they built this thing, they called it the Casino, and then everyone who's lived in the island since, for the last 85 years, had to have this explained to them, because when you're a billionaire, you lose 30 points off your IQ. And there was a live broadcast from the ballroom in the casino every Friday. It was a nationally syndicated show. And Zane Grey lived there, the great Western writer, and he liked to go game fishing, and they made a lot of Zane Grey movies on the island. This is where the invasive species comes in. So one of these movies called for 15 bison to be on in the film. So they brought 15 bison over, and they brought over 15 bulls. The number of bull bisons per herd is 1. 15 bull bison do not like to be in each other's company, and so within hours of bringing these bison to the island, they had 0 bison in captivity and 15 bison roaming the hills. Now, William Wrigley Jr. knew that this was a problem. He knew it was a problem because it was unchristian to have all these bachelors running around, so he brought over 13 cows for them. And so the invasive species on Catalina Island is bison. They have invasive bison. Catalina Island's an amazing place. Marilyn Monroe was a child bride there. The CIA was founded there. And in the channel, the deepest channel known to humanity, the Dow Chemical Corporation dumped 50,000 barrels of DDT that are not rated for depth, made of steel, slowly rusting, slowly imploding. No way to get them out of there. And when they go, all the birds downstream of there are gone. So visit the island while you can, admire the birds, because they won't be around much longer. So William Wrigley Jr. had this other weird peccadillo. He didn't like fast food restaurants. He thought they were déclassé, and he banned them on the island. This is where Marty and his friend come in. Marty's friend's name is Scott. Scott likes going to the island because he can hang around with real estate weirdos who throw good parties. They've got a lot of coke, and they don't want to talk about work. Right? You go out with tech bros, it's exhausting. They just want to talk about their startups. So he likes to hang out with these guys because they talk about inconsequentialities. And he's just trying to run at his time at Yahoo, vest out, leave, do something else consequential, never make that mistake again. And it is there that they discover that one of these real estate guys has founded a Ponzi scheme to sell fast food burgers on the island. Now, if you go to the little K-12 school on Catalina and you go for an away game, you're supposed to bring back a sack of burgers for your friends. That's one thing. But they start to do it on an industrial scale. And of course, like every pyramid scheme, they're not really selling hamburgers. They're selling the right to sell hamburgers. In fact, they're selling the right to sell the right to sell hamburgers. In fact, they're selling the right to sell the right to sell hamburgers. And pretty soon it's taking over the entire island's economy, which is what happens with Ponzi schemes. And so Marty and his friend get wind of this. They do a controlled demolition. They blow it up. They earn this guy's undying enmity. And also Marty's friend gets 2 felony convictions with a suspended sentence out of it. Because this guy works with the LA Sheriff's deputies, who are the law on Catalina Island. And if you don't know, LA Sheriff's deputies are one of the best armed criminal organizations in America. That's not hyperbole. Like they're criminal gangs within, not just one, but several criminal gangs within the LA Sheriff's deputies. Different ones, they have gang tattoos, gang signs, they run drugs, they do human trafficking. Some of them pit fight prisoners in the county jails. There's just like 3 of them that have run up a $55 million tab for civil rights settlements for the human civil rights abuses they've done in uniform. They're still on the force. No one seems to be able to do anything about it. And these guys are in cahoots with this real estate guy who's got the Ponzi scheme. Scott gets 2 suspended sentences, and then he gets a third. He gets a third felony when his car is stopped with some drugs in it, and this is in the era in which California has a 3 strikes law, where if you get convicted of 3 felonies, you automatically go to prison for the rest of your life, no chance of parole. And that's where the story really gets going. The shape of these Marty Hench novels is that they're about unbezzling Bezzles. They explain how these very complicated, performatively dull schemes work in a way that is exciting because it's attached to a kind of propulsive narrative. And doing that is, I think, not just a way to help people get their minds around something that is shrouded in a shield of boringness, something that is organized around what the finance sector calls MIGO, which stands for My Eyes Glaze Over. And it's the idea that if you make the prospectus thick enough, no one will read it. They'll just look at it and they'll say, any pile of shit this big must have a pony underneath it somewhere, and they'll sign. And so if you can puncture the shield of boringness, you can really help people avoid getting mired in the Bezzle. And so there are a series of scams in these books, in every one of them. And this one's got a big passage on how music royalty scams work, music royalty ripoffs modeled on the ripoff of George Clinton by his scumbag manager who stole all his royalties. It's got the Ponzi scheme. It's got all these different ways that scams affect people's lives. But the big central scam is a prison tech scam. So prison tech, thankfully, is not a huge thing in Canada, although there are lots and lots of American firms and Canadian firms that keep trying to privatize parts of our carceral system. In the United States, prison tech is a big piece of the prison system. We've all heard, I think, about privatized prisons that are owned by private equity funds or by investors. But there's, within the prison system, both in private prisons and in public prisons, there's private prison tech. And the way that this works, in its kind of purest form, is you have a tech bro who approaches a prisoner or jail, and they say, you've got a lot of expenses. We can help you with that. Tell you what, you get rid of your library, get rid of postal mail, get rid of parcels, get rid of ongoing education, take all the TVs away, and all the radios, and we're going to give every prisoner a free tablet. And then we're going to charge for those services significantly more than you or I would pay on the outside, 200 to 500% more than you and I would pay on the outside. Because, capitalists hate capitalism. Right? Nobody wants to compete. Competing is terrible. Someone could show up and compete better than you, and then you'd be on the breadline. Right? What's much nicer than competing is like you lock up all your workers with a non-compete, so that they can't compete and so that you can't be poached away. 1 in 8 American workers labors under a non-compete. The median American worker under a non-compete works at a fast food restaurant. And the non-compete stops them from moving from the fry trap at the Wendy's to the cash register at the McDonald's and getting under 25 cents an hour. However, the Federal Trade Commission outlawed all non-competes last week. So they don't like to compete for labor. Definitely don't like to compete for customers. Ever buy a bottle of water on the other side of the airport security checkpoint, right? Or inside a ballpark? They love a captive audience. And what audience could be more captive than prisoners? And so this has taken hold across America. And these companies, they give a kickback to the prison system. They do a revenue share. And so wherever you look, you're seeing this happen. Now the prisoners who are buying ebooks for $20 or paying $3 a minute for phone calls or $5 to have the card that their child drew for them scanned and sent to them because you can't get paper mail. These prisoners are working in prison workshops. The 13th Amendment to the US Constitution specifically does not abolish slavery for incarcerated people. They work in forced labor in prison workshops. They produce about $9 billion worth of products and services a year for the American economy. The median wage is 53 cents an hour, but in 6 states they can't get paid at all. In North Carolina, it's a maximum of $1 a day. And so that's the wages that they're using to buy. Their families might be able to buy for them, but of course their principal breadwinner is locked up. And here's the kicker. Private equity loves this business. And so we're now down to 2 of these companies that dominate the entire system. And every time they buy the prison tech company that provides prison tech for your prison, they change backends, they change clouds, and they wipe out all your stuff. That ebook that you had to work for 30 hours to pay for, that card that your kids sent you, all gone, and you're in prison for another 15 years. And so this is the scam that Marty decides he's going to really take on. This is the big Bezzle at the heart of the Bezzle. And I'm going to read you a little of how that starts. And I'm going to say that I have this theory I call the shitty technology adoption curve. And it's this idea that, like, if you've got something really awful that you want to do to people with technology, you don't start with me, right? I'm a middle-aged, middle-class white guy with a big megaphone, and when I complain, people listen to me. You've got to go out there and you've got to find people who, when they complain, nobody listens to them. So you start, when you've got a bad technology idea, you start by sanding the rough edges off on prisoners, on refugees, on mental patients. Then you work your way up to, elementary school students, people who are out on parole, blue-collar workers, and then it's like college kids, low-level white-collar workers. And then before you know it, we have this situation where 20 years ago, the only people who ate dinner in front of a CCTV were Supermax prisoners. And today, it's like people who have invested in a home camera system from Google, Apple, Amazon, or God help us all, Facebook, right? I had lunch today with William Gibson, one of Vancouver's private sons. And Bill, very famously, he said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. Well, if you want to find a place where your worst technological future has pooled up in great concentration, go look at how we treat prisoners. Or, ask Ian about how we treat college kids. That's the shitty technology adoption curve underway. There was a news article today in Law 360, which is the trade rag of the legal profession, about how one of the big law firms has just instituted work monitoring. Basically the same stuff Proctorio is doing, watching your eyeballs, counting your keystrokes, and deciding how much you're going to get paid on the basis of whether or not you look attentive when you're at the screen. So we have gone from college kids to low-level associates at big law firms in 3.5 years. The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So, here's the reading. San Genesius State Penitentiary is located just outside of Vacaville, about 3/4 of the way between San Francisco and Sacramento, set far enough back from I-880 that they don't have to post the usual signs about not picking up hitchhikers. It's a brooding place, the way prisons tend to be, H-shaped, with an original 1930s cinder block building as the crossbar, and 2 60s vintage wings on either end. Designed to house 700 inmates, home to 3 times that number. It smells, and the floors have lost their finish from prisoners' endless mopping, exposing rough aggregate surfaces that have absorbed an endless shower of fluids and misery. The first time I visited San Genesius was in late 2012, 4 months after Scott surrendered himself to the California Highway Patrol detail in Redway, California. He was accompanied by his lawyer, a very expensive fellow from a Silicon Valley firm who specialized in getting diversion or other wrist slaps for rich techies who got caught with Schedule II narcotics. He usually succeeded, but not in Scott's case. It wasn't even Scott's cocaine. I know, that sounds like the kind of bullshit anyone who gets busted would say, but I believe him. I enjoy a little coke now and again, but Scott doesn't. I'd seen him pass on so many bumps and lines. For Scott, it was magic mushrooms as a daily driver, LSD for special occasions, and mescaline, peyote, salvia, DMT, even ayahuasca when he wanted a true blowout. Scott just wasn't a coke kind of guy. Scott wouldn't say whose cocaine it was, because Scott wasn't a snitching kind of guy either. It was that refusal to throw someone to the lions that cost Scott his freedom. The cop who busted Scott doing 95 miles per hour on a winding stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway that was posted at 35, which was an idiotic thing that was, unlike cocaine, purely in character for Scott, found the coke when his dog alerted on Scott's car. It was downside of the passenger seat in a little baggie containing precisely 9.01 grams of powder cocaine of middling quality. That 0.01 was important because 9 grams is the threshold for an intent to sell rap, which is a Class B felony. Scott's fancy lawyer could have gotten him diversion if Scott had coughed up the name of whatever friend had been riding this passenger seat. Instead, he kept mum, and the prosecutor, furious with him and intending to send a message, made sure the judge knew that this was Scott's 3rd felony rap, the felony assault on an officer and felony possession charges from Catalina filling out his rap sheet. 3 strikes. In 2011, a third felony conviction meant an automatic 25 to life sentence under a vengeful 1994 law passed by state ballot initiative following the grisly murders of a teenager and a little girl. By 2012, that was softened thanks to another ballot initiative voted by a combination of horror at the state's bursting prisons and the cost of supporting so many young men who'd grown so old in those teeming lockups. Scott was arrested in late 2011, just after Thanksgiving. Bad timing. Scott was serving 25 to life in the minimum security wing of San Genesius State Pen, and I didn't know about it until I sent him an email and got an auto response warning me that he was, quote, away from my desk for the next quarter of a century. I left San Francisco early, but I was still nearly late. I was 20 minutes en route when I remembered that I wasn't allowed to wear any blue denim and had to race home and change out of my jeans. The rules for visiting Scott were so complex that I actually printed a checklist, e.g., spare keyring with only 2 keys, but I forgot about the jeans. The checklist was just the latest hurdle in a series of bureaucratic steps, starting with mailing Scott a letter requesting that he send me a CDCR 106 visitor questionnaire, which I then had to send back to the prison administration, who took a month to approve it. I got 5 $10 rolls of quarters at the bank and loaded them in a clear plastic bag along with my driver's license, and everything else stayed in the trunk. I handed my CDCR 106 in and submitted to a search and a metal detector scan, then sat tight in a visitor's lobby with the other visitors and waited to be called into the visitation room. Mine was the only white face in the lobby, apart from the guards. The largest group of visitors were young, sad women, often with kids. The second largest groups were older people with the wrung-out look of demoralized parents of adult children in crisis. Wives, kids, and parents amounted to 3/4 of the visitors. The rest were young men, friends, maybe siblings, staring hard at the floor or whispering to one another. I was nearly the last one to be called. I followed a guard, an older white guy with volcanic acne and a pronounced limp, into the visitation room. It was crowded, and the ancient body odor stink was overlaid with the odors of fresh scrubbed kids and the desperately cheerful perfumes of wives and girlfriends. Scott and I were assigned a table right in the middle, between a young black man and his sorrowing parents, a middle-aged Latina woman visiting a middle-aged man who looked enough like her that they were probably siblings, a black woman and her teenage son visiting their father behind me, and behind Scott, a Middle Eastern boy, barely 18, visiting with a girl no older than he, tears coursing down his cheeks while her shoulders shook from soft, hiccuping sobs. Scott was already at the table when I entered, shorn of his ponytail with a few days' facial stubble, looking doughy and hollow-eyed, not so much scared as disappeared. He registered me when I slid into my seat, a flick of his eyes. "Hi, Scott," I said. "Marty," he said in a numb voice, barely audible over the sounds around us. "Jesus," I said, "can you appeal?" At least I was able to set things up so that my lawyer would pay into my commissary. He patted his bulging stomach. "Keeps me out of the mess hall." I was briefly at a loss for words. Are you really going to spend 25 years here?" Again, with that half smile. Like everything else about Scott, it was recognizable as a distant cousin to the happy-go-lucky guy I'd spent all those weekends with on Catalina, but only just. This Scott looked like a lossy JPEG of himself. They tell me I can get a 3rd off for good behavior. We talked inconsequentialities for a while, mostly just me quizzing him about how I could help him, what I could send, who he wanted to hear from, what I could relay to people on the outside. Finally, I couldn't stop myself from asking, "But Scott, how the fuck are you gonna do this? Brother, you look half dead and it's only been 4 months. 25 years is a long time, but it's not forever. I don't want you to die in here. There's got to be a way for you to get through this. Can I sign you up for college classes? Anything?" Again, that flash in his eyes. "It's not my job to figure out how you can help me, Marty. I'm the one in prison." That rocked me back. It was right, of course. I'm sorry, I said. What if I stopped? What if what? What if I go talk to some lawyers, some advocacy organizations? What if I get you some magazine subscriptions? He nodded. I'd appreciate that. I think he meant it. At least, that's what I told myself. The drive home seemed twice as long as the drive up. I had to stop twice because I found myself crying. I was certain, absolutely certain, that Scott would not survive. I had just spent an hour with a man who was fixing to die. What's more, I didn't blame him. Not one bit. And that made me cry a little harder. 6 months later, he was a different man. Marty fucking Hench, he said, grinning broadly and drumming the table with his open palms. He threw his arms open, though he didn't rise for a hug, and gestured to my visitor's chair. Other prisoners and their families turned to stare at us briefly, then returned to their business. Scott Worms, I said, sitting down, you look amazing. And he did too, still pale, but fitter than the last time. His prison-issue jumpsuit no longer bulging at the gut, clean-shaved, hair buzzed to an all-over half-inch. What's your secret? Magic, he said. He grinned, the whole Scott Worms grinned this time, and waited for me to bite. I bit. Do go on, I said, grinning back. We've got a really great Dungeons and Dragons group here, he said. They've been playing for about 10 years now. There's a guy who makes miniatures and dice out of toilet paper mache, and when they sweep the cells and confiscate the dice, we draw dice rolls out of decks of cards. The GM has been inside since the 1980s, but he actually knew Gary Gygax. And he's had people on the outside who've been sending him books and modules in his quarterly packages for decades. He's published 2 character classes in Dragon and 4 modules with Judges Guild while he was inside. Then all the money they made went to the restitution for the liquor store owner he shot. That is a lot, I said. Give me a second. His smile widened. Okay, maybe start with the liquor store owner. Scott shrugged. It was a long time ago. Evan was strung out at the time. The guy lived. Evan's done 20 years and he hasn't touched heroin in decades. I'm not going to judge this guy by the things he did on the worst day of his life. He shrugged again, then the grin came back. Marty, that guy is a hell of a DM. And then he told me about his D&D games. No, really, Scott was a pretty good storyteller, but D&D games are like dreams, more fun to have than to hear about. There were some pretty funny moments when Scott's cleric rolled up some consecutive critical fails and healed the boss troll his party was fighting, but for the most part, it was an eye-glazing half hour. Not that I begrudged it. It was Scott's time, and he needed the freedom to spend it the way that he wanted, way more than I needed to direct the conversation. When the story wound down, I got up to leave, and so did Scott. We're allowed to hug, he said. Okay, I said. He always was a hugger. It went on for a while, and then I felt his fingers work at the waistband, at the side of my jeans, tucking something in there. I immediately felt like every person in that room was staring at us, guard, prisoners, and visitors. But no one seemed to notice. They were all wrapped up in their own drama. I drove back to I-880, then pulled off at a truck stop, parking far from the other cars before I fished in my waistband. It was written on both sides of a quarter sheet of paper, folded twice. The writing was cramped and so tiny that I had to squint. Marty, my DM has an old friend on the outside who gets some sheets of blotter acid disguised as graph paper for our games. He's a first-generation hippie chemist who learned his brew from Owlsley. The D&D club plays, but we also have a monthly trip. I was skeptical at first because I could not imagine having a bad trip while locked in a cage, but I was wrong. It literally saved my life. We start our trip together in the day room, play a while, get very silly, then we just start telling each other stories. We get pretty weird, but everyone who hears us assumes it's just part of the game. The DM has been making up his own variant rules for a quarter of a century, and honestly, the stuff we say when we're tripping is not much weirder than the stuff that we say when we're not. So long as we move our miniatures and roll our dice, everyone assumes it's just fine. Then we go back to our cells. They lock us in, and we finish out the trip in our bunks or with our cellies. We don't tell them. Well, they probably suspect something. But here's the deal. The DM is getting out, and he's not going to risk his parole by sending contraband inside. The risk of getting caught is low, but not if you're a felon mailing graph paper back inside, so for him it's high. Marty, I have a favor to ask. So that's the reading.